All right, well, thank you all for coming. And I'm very sorry I'm not there in person today. I got COVID yesterday, and so we have to make use of this technology that many of us have had to use too often in the past couple of years. So thanks for coming. And so this lecture series will be 12 talks given over 12 months on different aspects of the Eucharist. And tonight's talk is really in some ways the most important, because this will be, what we'll talk about tonight is, why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? And I'm going to suggest there are 3 reasons. But in the coming talks, we'll look, so the next one will be on the Old Testament. How does the Old Testament prefigure the Eucharist? And there's actually a lot to say about that, because God prepares for his great works. And so the Old Testament is actually full of prefigurations of the Eucharist. That'll be next month. Then we'll look at the New Testament on the Eucharist in the 3rd talk. And then on the fathers of the church, what do they say about the Eucharist and the real presence in particular? And then we'll look at a talk on the real presence. And then we'll go on to the sacrifice of the Mass and have several talks. And then at the end of this series, we'll look at Holy Communion. And as you can see, we've just sketched, I've named there the 3 purposes of the Eucharist that are the subject of tonight's talk: presence, sacrifice, and communion. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So the purpose of this series is, yes, it's to learn more about the Eucharist, but much more importantly, to have awe about the Eucharist, right? The Eucharist as the mystery of Christ's love, by which he gives himself to us entirely. So that's the goal, right? And so that'll be the test that we've done a good job, is if we come to have a greater love for the Eucharist through this series. John Paul II wrote a beautiful encyclical on the Eucharist called Ecclesia de Eucharistia, the Church from the Eucharist. And in that encyclical, he says this: the Eucharist, as Christ's saving presence in the community of the faithful and its spiritual food, is the most precious possession which the Church can have in her journey through history. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. Not only does he say that it is the greatest gift that the Church has, but it's the greatest which God could give her. Right? God's omnipotent. Right? God can do anything. But nevertheless, this is the greatest gift that God can give his Church. And the reason for that is because this gift is nothing less than himself, right? As we'll see more as we go along. There's a famous phrase of the Second Vatican Council, which you probably heard. It speaks of the Eucharist as the source and summit of the whole Christian life. It seems in some way contradictory. It's both the source, the foundation, and the summit of the Church's life. But it's very true, right? But what I'm going to suggest is it's true not just in one way, but in 3 ways. It's the source and the summit as presence, sacrifice, and communion. And that'll be basically the subject of this talk. Okay, the Eucharist is the sacrament of charity. The medieval theologians make a connection between the number of the sacraments, there are 7, and the principal virtues, which are also 7. And so they make a connection between each sacrament and each virtue. So baptism is tied with faith, because it's where we profess the faith. It's the sacrament that gives faith. And the Eucharist is connected with charity. And so I think that's the best way to approach the Eucharist, to reflect on, the Eucharist is the sacrament of Christ's love. And if we think about love, so love has lots of meanings, right? We use that word in all different ways. We speak about loving ice cream, but here we're going to take it in its highest sense, and that is spousal love. At least on the natural level, the highest form of love is a total self-gift that spouses make in in marriage, right? Which is a kind of image or icon of our love for God and his love for us. And if we think about spousal love, we can see there are three key dimensions to spousal love. A first dimension is presence, right? So spouses dwell together, right? We live together, and that's a key part of spousal friendship. But spousal friendship involves sacrifice, right? I have to sacrifice whatever impedes the union for the sake of my beloved, right? And very often, right, that's not inconsiderable. I think of what, and for one's beloved and for one's children, I think of what mothers do for their children, right, in labor, waking up in the middle of the night. And so spousal love, self-giving love, obviously involves sacrifice. But ultimately, the end or purpose of spousal love is union, right? The spouses give themselves to one another, holding nothing back. And so we can think of this with three prepositions here: dwelling with the beloved is presence, giving oneself for the beloved is sacrifice, and giving oneself to the beloved is union or unitive love. And so if we think about it, those properties of spousal love are the essence of the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is Christ's spousal love. He's the bridegroom and we're the bride. Right? And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Right? And so if Christ is the bridegroom and we're the bride, the Eucharist is his presence with us, dwelling with the beloved, his sacrifice for us, and his union with us, by which he gives himself totally to us. And so just, I think this is self-evident, proper to dwell with the beloved, right? Christ wished to remain to his disciples, to us, right? Not only as God, but also as man, right? So at the Last Supper, Jesus was faced with we could say a problem that would be humanly insoluble. And that is, he had to leave them, right? He tells them, it is better that I go, right? And he was going to leave them first in death the next day. And then he would rise. It's true, he also knew that, but he knew that he would leave this earth 40 days later in his ascension. And yet, the night before his death, he wanted to give them a gift by which he could remain with them while still leaving them. All right, so for us, that's impossible. We can't both leave and stay. But Jesus was able to do that, leaving them with his visible presence in death and in his ascension, but remaining in his Eucharistic presence and remaining in a better way, a far better way, right? Obviously, in one sense, not a better way, because his disciples could see him and now we can't see him, but in a better way, because when he still was present with his disciples, let's say at the Last Supper, he was only in one place at a time. Right? So he was with the 12 in the upper room, but he wasn't with all his other disciples in Galilee. Now, in the Eucharist, he's able to be with us wherever his bride is. That is, wherever there's a church with a priest who can celebrate Mass and make the Eucharist present, and a tabernacle to store it. Right? So that's abiding with the beloved. Right? So basically, at the Last Supper, this divine problem, how to leave and stay, right? So he left a gift that would be nothing less than himself. He left himself, but he left himself in a way that's veiled by the appearances of bread and wine. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then for the second aspect, sacrificial love. So he was about to die for his disciples, and not just those disciples, but all of his future disciples. And in fact, every human being who's ever lived and ever will live. Right? So he was about to die for all the human race. And that would be his sacrifice, right? So, and he wanted to leave that sacrifice to his bride. Right? This is the second divine problem. Now we can't do that. And so Christ, St. Paul says in Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her. Right? So Jesus knew he was going to sacrifice himself for his bride the following day on Good Friday. And yet he didn't want that act of sacrifice to simply be lost in the ongoing of time. So when we act, if somebody, a helpful analogy here might be thinking of someone who gives their life for another. So my favorite example here is St. Maximilian Kolbe. You know this story probably. St. Maximilian Kolbe was in a concentration camp, and someone escaped. And in retaliation, the Nazis picked out 10 people at random from the camp to starve them to death. And when the 10th person was picked, the man broke down crying, saying his family, right? And so Maximilian Kolbe raised his hand and said, I want to die in place of that man, right? Because I don't have a family. He was a monk, a friar, and a priest. And miraculously let him do it, right? And so he died for that man. And that man for whom he died at first fell into a depression. But then he came to realize, I have to live and survive this. So at least the memory of that sacrifice could be, would not be lost. And in fact, he did live to, when the camp was liberated, he survived and was able to tell the story. And in fact, was able to present the gifts at the beatification of St. Maximilian Kolbe. Now, in that case, he was able to retain the memory of the sacrifice. And that's all we can do for human affairs that happened in the past, right? So I don't know, in July 4th, we commemorate the independence, right? So we're recalling a past event. And that's the best we can do. But Jesus wanted to do something better. He wanted to give to his bride, not just the memory of Good Friday, but the actuality, the reality of Good Friday. In fact, he wanted to give the sacrifice that he was about to make the next day for his bride. He wanted to give that to the church so it could become our sacrifice, so that we could offer it with him to his Father. All right, this is probably the hardest part about understanding the mystery of the Eucharist, that it's a sacrifice. And in fact, it's the same sacrifice as Calvary. And Jesus has wanted that so that that sacrifice that he did on our behalf when we weren't there, right? So I wasn't on Calvary 2,000 years ago and you weren't either, none of us. And he didn't want us to be deprived of participating in the most important event of the history of the universe, Jesus' sacrifice for us on Calvary. So he gave to his church this gift, the Eucharist, that is that same sacrifice. Now you may be thinking, how can it be the same sacrifice? And I'm going to put that question off until talk number, I think it's number 6. Sorry about that. We'll come back to that question and we'll have a longer answer to it. Right, so we could say so this is from Benedict the 16th. He has a beautiful encyclical on, this is from Deus Caritas Est, his first encyclical. The Eucharist draws us on charity. And he says, the Eucharist draws us into Jesus' act of self-oblation, more than just statically receiving the incarnate Logos, right? That's, I think, most of us, when we think about the Eucharist, we think about receiving communion. And obviously that's important, but it's more than just communion, right? It's also his very sacrifice on Calvary. And so we enter into the dynamic of his self-giving. In other words, we offer him to the Father, and we have to offer ourselves too. That's what the Eucharist is really about. It's about each one of us offering ourselves with Jesus. to the Father, right? And that's why there's a Sunday Mass obligation. I think most of the faithful don't realize that, right? We tend to think, yes, we know we're required to go to Mass, hopefully. We know that we're required to go to Mass on Sunday and holy days of obligation, but perhaps we don't ask why, right? We're not required in order to receive communion. We're just required that once a year. The reason why we're required to go to Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation is so that we can join in the offering. We can offer Jesus to the Father and offer ourselves with him as a community. And again, we'll talk more about this in later talks. And then finally, spousal love seeks union, right? Not only to dwell with the beloved and sacrifice oneself for the beloved, but through self-sacrifice to enter into the most intimate union with the beloved. That's its final purpose, right? And that's the aspect of Holy Communion, by which Jesus gives himself totally to us in all that he is. And that's why we say body, blood, soul, and divinity, right? He gives himself totally to us. And of course, we're to give ourselves to him, right? And that's what we do when we make a thanksgiving after receiving Holy Communion. And we'll have several talks on this aspect as well. And then going together with that, Jesus wants to tie us together. He wants to bond us to one another so that the whole church be made more one through charity, right? And so by giving himself to each of us, he also bonds us with one another, right? And so the Eucharist deepens our communion with one another. So when we say the Eucharist is a mystery of communion, there's two aspects to that, right? So it's communion directly with Jesus, that's who we receive, and through Jesus with the Holy Spirit and his Father. But also it's a communion with all of the others who receive Holy Communion, and that is with the whole church. So the Eucharist is the sacrament of ecclesial unity. And it's not just a symbol of ecclesial unity, it actually binds us more closely together by nourishing us with charity, charity being the bond of union in the church, right? The church is one, yes, because we share a common faith, common governance, right? We have the same pastors, but most of all, the church is one because of love, right? Which is nourished in us from above, and principally by the Eucharist. And St. Paul speaks about this in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 17. We being many are one bread, one body, all that partake of the one bread, right? And that one bread is Christ, right? So Christ, in nourishing us with his own love, he makes us more one with all the other members of the body. And we'll have a whole talk on this towards the end. And of course, this should have huge implications for how we live our life, right? And this is the motor, we could say, for all the charitable action of the church. It's not just simply a human charity, but a divine charity that is nourished in us by the Eucharist. Okay. All right, so in summary, what we're saying is Jesus instituted the Eucharist for three reasons, right? First, to perpetuate his human presence among us. He's always present, right, as God. So I'm in my basement here. And so Jesus is present here as I'm speaking with you, but in his divinity, not in his humanity. But where you are, down the hall is the chapel at the Regali Center, and Jesus is present there, not just as God, but as man. And that's important, because Jesus became man for a reason, right? To be with us as we are, right? To share our nature and to be present with us as a man among other human beings. And so the Eucharist perpetuates that, right? And that's you could say the first end, and it's necessary for the other two, right? So the second purpose of the Eucharist is to perpetuate, that is to make continually present throughout the time of the church, the sacrifice of Good Friday, right? The sacrifice of Calvary, the supreme act of his charity, and to allow us to join with him in offering it to the Father and to offer ourselves with him. Right? So that's the second reason. And notice how that presupposes the first. It wouldn't be his sacrifice. So the reason why I said I was going to explain this later. The short answer is this. How is the Mass the same sacrifice as Calvary? Well, who's present on the altar? Jesus, right? The same Jesus that was the victim on Calvary. And who's the priest in the Mass? Jesus is the high priest. Yes, he uses the lips and hands of his ordained ministers who are acting in his person, but he's the principal high priest in every Mass. So in every Mass, Jesus is both priest and victim. And so it's essentially the same sacrifice because we have the same Jesus on the altar. And that is only true because of his real presence. Right? So the real presence is the foundation for the Mass being a true sacrifice and the same sacrifice of Calvary. And then the third purpose, so that he can give himself totally to us in Holy Communion, right? To be our spiritual food and drink, and to nourish us with his life, which means his love, right? His light and his love and his life, right? And that too presupposes the real presence, right? Because if Jesus isn't really present on the altar, then he's not giving himself to us, but he would just be giving us a sign of his presence, bread and wine. But that's not true, right? He's really present under the appearance of the bread and wine. And so he's giving himself to us in Holy Communion in all that he is, right? So all three purposes, presence, sacrifice, and communion, follow an order. And that order is also the chronological order in the Mass, right? At the words of consecration, Jesus becomes present, right, in his human presence, in his body and blood on the altar. At that very same moment, he's present as victim and priest. And so at the same moment that he becomes present in the real presence, it also becomes, it makes his sacrifice present. And we'll talk more about that later, but it makes his sacrifice present because he's present in his body and his blood. And just as on Calvary, his blood got physically separated from his body, right, bringing about his death, his blood coming out of his hands and feet, and then at his death, after his death, from his side. So in the Mass, the blood is consecrated separately from the body to represent his sacrifice, right? He doesn't die in the Mass, right? Because he can die no more. He's died once and for all, but he's truly present, the same victim of Calvary, Christ, always the same, and with his same intention of giving himself totally for us and to us. And then the final aspect of communion then takes place at the end of the Mass, right, in the rite of communion. But the second and third presuppose the first, the real presence. And this is just simply to illustrate that second purpose, that it's not just the priest who offers Christ to the Father, but your holy people, the priest says, we, your servants and your holy people, offer to you, your glorious majesty, this pure victim, this holy victim, this spotless victim. So the whole church offers the sacrifice through the hands of the ministerial priest. All right, I think we can see from this, what we've just said, that the Eucharist is not an afterthought, not some mere external rite, not some marginal element of the church's life, not something that, we wouldn't give much importance to. Quite the contrary, right? The Eucharist obeys the same, we could say, logic of love, the same divine logic as the Incarnation and the Passion. for it is simply their prolongation throughout the life of the church until he comes again in glory. Right? Their prolongation in that the Eucharist makes Christ present in his humanity, in his passion, and allows him to give himself to us until he comes again. Right? And so we could say that the Eucharist realizes the same purposes as the incarnation. Right? That's a strong statement. Let's go through that. So for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on that. So why did Jesus, so I started this, I should say something. Sorry, this is a little parentheses. In doing theology, it's really important to ask the why question, right? The purpose of theology, and therefore of not just of theology for theologians in the classroom, but for adult faith formation, for passing on the faith, is to always ask the why question and to try and look at the mysteries of the faith from God's point of view. And that's what we're trying to do here. In other words, so why did Jesus institute the Eucharist? That's what we're looking at. And we can ask the same question about why did God become man in the first place? Right? What are the purposes of the incarnation? And I think you could do this in lots of different ways. Thomas Aquinas gives 10 reasons for the incarnation. I'm just going to give 3 here because they match up with the 3 reasons for the Eucharist. God became man to dwell among us, right? As a man among human beings. And then secondly, he became man so as to sacrifice himself for us, to reconcile us with God and win the forgiveness of sins and merit every grace, right? So that's, I think this is the reason that we generally tend to think of first. This is the reason that St. Anselm, in his famous book, Why Did God Become Man, speaks about. So God became man so that he could offer a perfect sacrifice to atone for sin. Right? But another reason why God became man is to bring us into union with himself by giving us a share in his divine life. And I think maybe we tend not to focus on this enough. This is something that the Eastern tradition highlights more. And we could call it divinization. And so God, the Son of God, becomes a son of man so as to bring the sons and daughters of men to be sons and daughters of God. So there's a divine interchange. God becomes man so as he takes on what is ours, humanity, death, so as to give us a share of what is his, and that is a share in his divine life and beatitude. And so those, we could say, are the 3 purposes of the incarnation: to dwell among us, to sacrifice himself for us, and to divinize us. Right? And so you can see they coincide with the reasons for the Eucharist. And the Eucharist, in fact, prolongs them throughout the life of the church and applies them to us, enables us to come into contact with him and his sacrifice and his divinizing life. So let's start with the first one. I'll talk more about this next month when we look at how the Old Testament prefigured the Eucharist. So if you read the Old Testament, you can see that one of the great glories of Israel was a special indwelling presence of God in their midst that was in the holy place. And so that holy place was the tent of meeting and the Ark of the Covenant, which then eventually got brought into the temple in Jerusalem at the time of David and Solomon. And that in the Ark of the Covenant, God dwelt in a special way, whatever that means. And sometimes he manifested that presence with a visible kind of cloud of glory cloud, which is called the Shekinah. And that simply comes from the Hebrew word to dwell or abide. And since the Jews were at this time nomadic people, to dwell or abide as in a tent. And so this was first manifested on Mount Sinai in the cloud of glory that covered Mount Sinai, out of which God spoke to Moses, and then covered the tent of meeting and came to rest over the Holy of Holies in the temple. Right? And you can see that was a figure of the incarnation. Right? God wasn't really present in a physical way, in the flesh, in that Shekinah. It was a type pointing forward to the incarnation. And so in the incarnation, the way John speaks about that in his prologue to his gospel. The word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And he uses this word dwelt, he uses a Greek word as close as possible to the Hebrew shachan or Shekinah. Skenosen is the Greek word. Sorry, the Greek isn't necessary for this talk, but or the Hebrew. But the point is that John very much had the Shekinah in his mind, and he's saying that was pointing that God really dwelt among us when he became man. Right? And so God has entered our cosmos as a man in our midst. He who is incomprehensible and immense, right, and omnipotent, has entered into our world, has entered into history, has become limited, right, limited by a human body, has entered into time, precisely so that he could dwell in our midst, something motivated by love, right? Love wants to dwell with the beloved, right? And so God became flesh and dwelt among us as in a tent, as it were, in our midst, right? So that's a key purpose of the incarnation. He's our bridegroom, right? The God of Israel is Israel's bridegroom. And so the bridegroom wants to share in the life of the bride. And so he takes on our flesh and dwells among us. Right? And we can speak of this as the self-emptying. And St. Paul speaks about this in the famous hymn of Philippians, where he says, Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man. Right? So God became man to dwell amongst us in our midst. But the difficulty with that is that becoming a human being can only be in one place at one time, and that happened 2,000 years ago, and a very long ways away in Galilee, in Jerusalem, and we weren't there. Right? And so we could see the Eucharist is prolonging the logic of the incarnation, enabling us to encounter that same humanity here. Right? So for you in the Regali Center, down the hall in the chapel, there is God made man. Right? And again, we take this for granted. I teach at the seminary, and so it's the same thing. God is down the hall, and I forget that sometimes. We ought not to forget that, but that's a better presence than was the case in Galilee, right? Where he was only, if he was in Peter's house in Capernaum, he wasn't elsewhere. But now he can be in all of the places where his church is. Right? So, but at the same time, he's also emptied himself even more. Right? And so if the incarnation was a self-emptying, God becomes man. He takes on limitation. He who is omnipotent becomes first a fetus, right? And then an infant and a human being with all the limitations of human beings, size and strength and place, etc. So he emptied himself, right? It's not that when we say that, we don't mean he stopped being God. It's just that he took on human nature, right? And its limitations. And so in some way, his majesty was veiled, right? So the people who saw him in Capernaum, or before that, his fellow citizens from Nazareth, clearly they saw the humanity, but they missed the divinity. So that's the self. But in the Eucharist, he's taken this self-emptying even further because he's hidden his humanity as well. So on the cross, Jesus' humanity was there, but his divinity was hidden, except for those who believed, Mary and John. But in the Eucharist, he veils his humanity as well, right? Behind very common appearances, the appearances of bread and wine. Right? And so again, we can see the humility of God. Right? He hides himself behind sacramental veils of the most common things, bread and wine. Right? And that's a sign of Christ's love. This is a quote from Thomas Aquinas here. So he says, this belongs to Christ's love, out of which for our salvation, he assumed a true body of our nature. And because it is the special feature of friendship to live together with friends, in our pilgrimage, he does not deprive us of his bodily presence. Right? So he's speaking after his ascension, but unites us with himself in this sacrament through the truth of his body and blood. Hence he says, he that eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me and I in him. And this is the sign of supreme charity from such familiar union of Christ with us. Right? It's proper to friends and proper to spouses to live together. Christ lives with us in the Eucharist. Another thing about the incarnation that goes together with this is the merit of faith, right? So God became man, and that's the hardest thing to believe, right? That true God becomes true man, right? And we believe that through the gift of faith, right? Faith is of things that are not seen. And so the incarnation gives to each one of us the merit of believing in the hardest thing. We could say that even the doubting Thomas, when he stuck his fingers into Jesus' side, right? And he says then, my Lord and my God. He saw one thing and believed another, right? He saw the humanity and believed in the divinity, my Lord and my God. With regard to the Eucharist, there's an even greater merit of faith because we see neither the humanity nor the divinity. Right? And so the Eucharist is given to us in part so that we can exercise faith and have the merit of faith. Right? So as to merit seeing face to face, which will happen in heaven. Right? So here on earth, we believe things that we don't see in order to be able to come to see them and be totally united to them in heaven. Right? And so the Eucharist, for this reason, is the mystery of faith, right? Because we don't see Jesus either in his humanity or in his divinity. Right? On the cross, the humanity was visible, divinity veiled. In the host, both are veiled, right? Doubly veiled. And this, St. Thomas Aquinas expresses this in his hymn, Adoro te devote. Sight, touch, and taste in thee are each deceived. The ear alone most safely is believed. I believe all the Son of God has spoken, then truth's own word, there is no truer token. God only on the cross lay hid from view, but here lies hid at once the manhood too. Right? So again, that gives us that merit of faith in believing in the real presence, right? Even though no empirical test will show the difference between a consecrated host and an unconsecrated host, except in the case of miraculous hosts. Okay, let's go on to the second purpose of the incarnation, his sacrifice, right? So God became man so that as man, he could offer himself out of love, right, for all men and atone for sin by offering something more pleasing than all human sin together is displeasing. This is what happened on Calvary 2,000 years ago, right? Jesus offered himself divine person, offered himself with maximum charity for love for us and for his Father, atoning for sin, and therefore offering something more pleasing than all sin put together from the beginning of the world to the end was displeasing. All right, so this is a key purpose of the incarnation. All right, and we said, yes, Jesus prolongs that in the Eucharist because he makes that same sacrifice present in our midst day by day. Right, and this is why it's, if we're able to go to Mass every day is a great gift, right? To be able to make Calvary the center of each day of my life. I couldn't go today because of COVID, but at least I could do live streaming. All right, so in the Eucharist, that sacrifice is mystically made present on our altars, right? Poured out for the living and the dead. And we could say the same thing is true of the Eucharist as we just said about Calvary. So Calvary is more pleasing, was more pleasing than all sin was displeasing. The same thing is true of every offering of the Eucharist, every sacrifice of the Mass. Because it has the same Jesus as priest and victim, it's more pleasing than all human sin put together is displeasing. And we can see this aspect of sacrifice in Jesus' words at the Last Supper, when he speaks of his blood, my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And so we can see that in Jesus' own words, the Eucharist is the blood of the covenant poured out for the forgiveness of sins. In other words, what would happen the next day on Calvary was made present the night before at the Last Supper and is made present in every Holy Mass, right? In which we've got that same blood of the covenant poured out for the forgiveness of sins. And John kind of shows this when in John's Gospel, he doesn't give us the institution of the Eucharist, but he gives us a much longer account of the Last Supper. And he starts it with this beautiful verse. It's John 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And that's a beautiful description of the institution of the Eucharist, right? As well as what would happen the next day on Calvary. So obviously on Calvary, Jesus loved us to the end, right? To the end of his life. But at the Last Supper as well, he has loved us to the end by making that sacrifice present. And so the Catechism speaks of the Eucharist as the memorial of the love with which he loved us to the end, right? John 13:1, even to the giving of his life. All right, third purpose of the incarnation, divinization. God became man so that human beings could be divinized and come to share in the divine nature. He took on what is ours so that we could come to share in what is his. We could think of this as descent and ascent. God descended into our world in the incarnation, becoming man, so as to bring us with him into heaven. So that's by divinizing us and giving us a share in his life and beatitude. Right? That starts here on earth, but culminates in heaven. In Peter's second letter, 1:4, he speaks of being made partakers of the divine nature. Right? That's what we mean by sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace is sharing in the divine nature. And since God is love, sanctifying grace implies charity. Right? So sharing in the divine nature means sharing in God's ability to love, right? Which is God's inner life. And so God has become man so as to give us a share in his divine nature and a growing share in his charity. Right? And that's the new commandment, to love one another as Jesus has loved us, not simply as we love ourselves, but as Jesus has loved us. John in 1:16 in his gospel, he says, from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. In other words, God becomes man so that as man, he becomes the source of our sanctification and divinization. And the key link there is the Eucharist, right? He becomes man, but he left this earth 2,000 years ago in his ascension, which we just celebrated last Sunday. So how do we come in contact with his life-giving humanity, his divinizing humanity? The answer is the Eucharist, right? Because that humanity is present here, right, in the Eucharist, and we come into contact with him. And he gives us grace upon grace. And so he takes on our condition to clothe us with his condition. There's a quote from St. Augustine. He says, it was not enough for our God to promise us divinity in himself unless he also took on our infirmity, as though to say, do you want to know how much I love you? How certain you ought to be that I'm going to give you my divine reality. I took to myself your mortal reality. The Son of God became a son of man in order to make sons of men into sons of God. The maker of man was made man so that man might be made a receiver of God. Right? And we become properly a receiver of God in the Eucharist, right? Receiving Jesus in Holy Communion. And this divine interchange initiates a matrimonial bond. So I started out by speaking about that. Jesus is the bridegroom. All right, in the Old Testament, God presents himself as the bridegroom, right? So in Hosea chapter 2, God says, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord, right? And that got realized in the incarnation, right? So here in Hosea, it's spoken of in the future, a future betrothal. And so John the Baptist had the glory of proclaiming that the promised bridegroom was come. He who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, John the Baptist, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. For this reason, my joy has been fulfilled. Right? And Jesus speaks of the parable of the wedding feast of the king's son. Well, who's the king's son? Jesus. Right? And the wedding feast is, in fact, the new covenant. And in a particular way, the Eucharist. Right? The Eucharist is the wedding feast of the Lamb. Right? And the fathers of the church speak about this. So Cyril of Jerusalem, speaking about Holy Communion, says, by partaking of the body and blood of Christ, you may become of one body and blood with him. Right? That's proper to marriage. To the spouses become one flesh. And he continues, for when his body and blood become the tissue of our members, we become Christ bearers and partakers of the divine nature. And it's according to 2 Peter 1:4. So the Eucharist is a spousal mystery in which Christ the bridegroom gives himself to us. And that's expressed in the offertory prayer at the Eucharist. So the priest says at the offertory, by the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. Right? That's the divine interchange. Right? It's the purpose of the incarnation, and it's realized above all through the Eucharist. Now, somebody may be thinking, well, what about those who can't receive the Eucharist? Well, there is spiritual communion enables this to happen in those who are unable to actually receive the Eucharist, right? They can still come to, so for example, I couldn't go to Mass today, so I got to do a spiritual communion and ask Jesus to come into my heart. It's obviously better to receive him sacramentally, though. The same idea is in the collect for Christmas Mass. O God, who wonderfully created the dignity of human nature and still more wonderfully restored it, right, on Calvary, grant, we pray, that we may share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. And in that we receive it, when we receive Holy Communion, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So we can see that the incarnation is ultimately about a nuptial mystery, a spousal mystery. God wedding his people, coming to meet us where we are so that he can bring us where he is, right? And that purpose of the incarnation is essentially realized in the Eucharist, right? During our exile, right? So we're a bride in exile from the bridegroom, right? The bridegroom is already in heaven. Our Lady is there in her body as well, through her assumption, but we're not there. And yet he still wants us to join in the wedding feast, but a wedding feast proper to our state of trial. And that means not directly seeing the bridegroom, but believing in him, right? Believing him in his veiled presence. So in summary, the Eucharist is the gift that Christ makes of himself. So this is Pope Benedict the 16th from his apostolic exhortation on the Eucharist called Sacramentum Caritatis, another beautiful document on the Eucharist. So he says there, he speaks of the Eucharist as the sacrament of charity, the gift that Jesus Christ makes of himself, revealing to us God's infinite love for every man and woman. This wondrous sacrament makes manifest that greater love, which led him to lay down his life for his friends. He did indeed love them, love us to the end. Right? So in summary, our three purposes: presence, dwelling with the beloved; sacrifice, giving himself for the beloved; and unitive love. And the Eucharist makes present all three of those purposes of the incarnation. Right? So I'll leave it there. And I think we can have time for questions. All right, that's not so simple. And that will be the subject of talk number 5. I'm sorry, that's 5 months away though. But so I think it's the best way to, in speaking about something like that, I think it's always good to start with the why question before the how. So it's helpful to think first about why Jesus would want to make himself present by transubstantiation rather than the how. But and that's what we did tonight. But let me just say something about the how. So God is omnipotent, right? So God at the beginning of the world said, "Let there be light," and there was light. No problem, right? For God. And Jesus is God, right? And therefore, even though his humanity is limited, his divinity is omnipotent. And so when Jesus says something, he has the power to make it happen, right? And so the best way maybe to think about this is Jesus' miracles, right? So when the leper comes to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." And Jesus says, "I will be clean," right? The words of Jesus, the words that he spoke, were words of power that did what they said. All right. So and we can see that in all of his different healing miracles. He spoke words of power. The same thing, it's the same Jesus at the Last Supper who speaks words of power. And those words are, "This is my body." And so if we just analyze that little phrase, the "this" at the beginning of the sentence would have been bread, right? The matzah, the unleavened bread that he was using at the Passover. But at the end of the sentence, it's what he says it is, my body. And so that just right there, that's what we mean by transubstantiation. One thing, bread, unleavened bread, becomes another reality, my body, that is Jesus' body. And how does it happen? Simply through the omnipotent power of Jesus's words. The same power that at the beginning created the world out of nothing. All right, so why should we believe in transubstantiation? Simply because Jesus said so, and he had the power to make what he said be true. All right, so that's the simple version. Now, there's an odd thing about transubstantiation. That's why we use this word transubstantiation rather than transformation. In other changes, so this change is a little different than others. In this change, the key difference is that the appearances of the bread and wine remain. And of course, that's what makes it hard to believe. It wouldn't be hard to believe in the Eucharist if we actually saw Christ on the altar 6 foot tall, but that doesn't happen, right? We still see the appearances of what was there at the beginning, the bread and the wine. And again, the helpful thing, I think, is to think why. Why would Jesus want to keep the appearances of bread and wine? And there are actually two very important reasons for this. The most obvious is that if he didn't keep the appearances of bread and wine, we could not receive Holy Communion. We wouldn't be able to receive him as our spiritual food and drink. The 6 foot Jesus in his whole body, right? That wouldn't fit into my mouth. Sorry. In other words, thanks be to God, he keeps the appearances of bread and wine so that we can receive him whole and entire, but in a way suited to human beings, right? Suited to what we eat and drink. So he's kept the appearances of what was there before so that we could receive him. That's the first reason. And then the second reason is so that we could have the merit of faith that I mentioned earlier. Right? So because he keeps the appearances of bread and wine, we get the merit of believing in his word. Why should we believe in his word? Because he's God made man, right? And he can do what he says. And yes, we believe that. And the reason why we believe it isn't because we're, like, I don't know, spiritually great. No, it's because it's a gift, right? The gift of faith that he gives to us to believe that. He gives us that gift, but then he enables us to merit by exercising it whenever we receive Jesus. All right, so I'll speak at much greater length about this in talk number 5. But basically, I would answer in that way. One substance, bread, and wine become another, Jesus' body and blood, through his power, that is the divine power, that can make one thing into another thing. Right? It's not difficult for Jesus to make bread and wine into his body and blood. What was difficult was dying for us on Calvary. But making bread and wine into his body and blood, that's a piece of cake, as it were, for Jesus' power. Right? And why does he want to keep the appearance of bread and wine? For the reasons that we just said, above all, so that we can receive him in a human way. Great question. So it's helpful to know a little bit about the Jewish meaning of that word, do this as a memorial of me. It's actually, he's quoting Exodus chapter 12. And I'll talk a little more about this in the next talk next month when we look at the Old Testament figures. So in Exodus 12, God commands the Israelites to celebrate the Passover. And the Hebrew word is zikaron, which means a memorial sacrifice. So the Passover was commanded as a memorial of the past event, but Jews are to think of the Passover every year as making present that past event. So in the Jewish context, do this as a memorial for me would not be understood in our sense of, I don't know, the memorial of the 4th of July or something like that. In other words, in the Jewish context, a memorial is a sacrifice, right? So the Passover every year was a sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice recalling a past event, making it present today, and prefiguring and anticipating a future event, right? So the Jewish Passover was anticipating the coming of the Messiah, right? So actually the Jewish memorial sacrifices had 3 levels of time: past, present, and future. And the Eucharist does as well, right? So if the Passover, the past event was the Exodus, the present event is Jews celebrating the Passover today, and the future event is the coming of the Messiah. That's the way they understood it. In the Eucharist, the past event is Jesus's sacrifice on Calvary 2,000 years ago, but it's made present today because we've got the same victim and the same priest. And it also is the pledge of future glory, and we could say an anticipation of the cosmic or celestial liturgy that will be the life of heaven as we kind of see it in the book of Revelation. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. But so memorial in the Jewish context doesn't mean simply a remembering of a past event, but it really means making that past event present. Now, the Eucharist, though, makes the past event present in a greater way than the Jewish Passover could make the original Passover present. And the greater way is precisely because of the real present. Christ becomes present on the altar, the same victim and the same priest as on Calvary. Right? Great question. Great. So yes, but not in the same way. His resurrection is present because the Jesus who's on the altar is in fact the risen Christ. Right? So Christ, so when we receive Holy Communion, we receive the risen Lord, right? And he's giving us a share of his risen life. So in that sense, yes, the resurrection is also part of the Eucharistic mystery. But nevertheless, we want to say that both things are true. The Mass makes his sacrifice present, right? Makes Calvary present, and makes the risen Lord present. Right? So in some way, it includes all the dimensions of what we call the Paschal mystery: passion, death, and resurrection. But still, it's not a good idea. So some churches have above the altar a resurrectrix. In other words, an image of the risen Lord. I don't recommend that. It's traditional to have the crucifix above the altar, precisely because the Eucharist is making Christ's sacrifice present. But yes, he becomes present as the risen Lord.
All right, Dr. Feingold, I think that our thrill will be when you can be here in person.
God willing, next month.
Yep, God willing. And thank you so much for your beautiful presentation tonight.
Thank you. Let's end with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for the gift of the Eucharist through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all for attending. Next month in person, God willing.